July 1943, Sicily, Italy. Altitude, 0 meters. The air is thick with the scent of dried lemon groves and approaching thunder. This is not the thunder of a Sicilian summer storm. This is the distant, rhythmic rumble of heavy armor landing on the beaches of Gela and Licata. It is the sound of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Italy, and it is the sound that would shatter the confidence of the Regio Esercito's armored divisions. For the men inside the Italian tanks, this invasion was not just a military challenge. It was an indictment of the machines they had placed their trust in, a judgment that was already sealed by years of technological neglect. The Italian tank force, when it was conceived in the 1930s, was built for a different war, one fought in the deserts of North Africa, driven by the doctrines of speed and surprise, and designed to fight other lightly armed colonial powers. Their workhorse, the Carro Armato M1340 and its subsequent iterations, the M1441 and M1542, were sturdy, handsome machines. They were the pride of a modernizing Italy, armed with a decent 47mm gun, protected by riveted steel plate and manned by proud crews. What they did not know, however, was that their machine was already a relic. The engineers and high command, blinded by the early promise of expansion, clung to outdated doctrines. While the Allies and Germans were rapidly upgunning and thickening the armor of their vehicles, in response to battlefield lessons, Italy's industrial base, constrained by limited resources and an over-reliance on pre-war design, struggled to keep pace. The very tanks rolling off the assembly lines in 1942 were direct, slightly modified descendants of 1930s concepts. They were equipped with gasoline engines that were prone to catching fire, a deadly trait on a hot, arid battlefield. Their armor, though rated up to 40 or 50 millimeters, was often constructed from inferior steel, brittle under high-velocity impact. We must understand the crew's perspective. For the young Caristi, the Italian tank soldiers, this was the finest vehicle their nation could produce. They polished the steel, maintained the engines with meticulous care, and trained relentlessly to load that 47mm main gun. Sergeant Antonio Rinaldi, a tank commander in the Ariete Armored Division, recalled in his later memoirs, "We were told our M1441 was the equal of any British cruiser tank. We felt invincible, a fist of steel for the Duce." That confidence was a psychological shield, far thicker than the steel plate that protected them. It was a confidence about to be vaporized by the first shells fired from the enemy's heavier guns. The initial encounters in Sicily were confusing, almost misleading. The enemy's advance wasn't always a relentless charge. Sometimes it was a slow, agonizing grind. Italian tankers first faced relatively light American armor, like the M3 Stuart light tank. They could hold their own. The 47mm Cannonade 4732 could still penetrate the Stuart's thinner armor. And in close-quarters skirmishes, the M1542's lower profile could even be an advantage. But the intelligence reports coming back to headquarters were laced with growing panic. A new, much larger machine was appearing on the American line, a machine that dwarfed the M1542. This was the American M4 Sherman. The Sherman was the embodiment of the titanic industrial power the United States had unleashed. Designed for mass production and reliability, the M4 was a leap in class, not just a simple upgrade. It was heavier, better protected, and crucially, armed with a 75mm M3 main gun. The 47mm Italian gun was a decent anti-tank weapon against early war models. The 75mm American gun was a heavy-hitting destroyer. The ironical contrast was not just in gun caliber, but in production scale. While Italy struggled to produce a few hundred tanks of a specific model, the United States was turning out thousands of Shermans a month. The sheer volume was a factor that Caristi had never been trained to comprehend. They were fighting not just a tank, but an overwhelming industrial tide. The early Italian pride, that shield of invincibility, was beginning to corrode. It started with whispered stories among the crews, tales of shells hitting the Sherman's thick frontal glacis plate and simply ricocheting into the sky, stories of Italian tanks bursting into flames after a single catastrophic hit. The enemy had arrived, and their machines seemed to possess an unnatural resilience. As the sun set on the first weeks of the invasion, the truth began to solidify in the minds of the Italian tankers. Their M1542 was not an equal. It was a challenger bringing a knife to a gunfight. And the true brutal test, the clash that would force them to confront the terrifying reality of their obsolescence, was yet to come. The first act of the campaign was over, but the grim drama of technological inadequacy was only just beginning to unfold. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine courage not as victory, but as the willingness to face almost certain defeat. August 1943, southern Sicily. The dust of the mainland clings to everything, coating tanks and men alike in a fine ochre film. The narrative shifts from initial shock to the calculated reality of combat. The M1542 was the ultimate evolution of Italian medium tank design, a four-man crew, a top speed of 40 km/h, and that venerable 47mm gun. Its armor was riveted, a construction method inherited from the previous decade. Riveting meant that when a high-velocity shell struck the plate, the bolts holding the armor could shear off and fly around inside the turret like shrapnel, injuring or killing the crew without the shell even penetrating. It was a built-in vulnerability, a ghost of outdated engineering haunting every vehicle. Meanwhile, the Americans were fielding the M4A3 Sherman. While the Sherman would later gain a reputation for certain flaws, particularly a tendency to brew up or catch fire when hit, in 1943 it was a technical marvel to the Italian eye. It was heavier, topping 30 metric tons. Its armor was cast and welded, a stronger, more resilient design. Crucially, the M4A3 variant was often powered by the reliable Ford GAA V8 gasoline engine, giving it superior mobility for its weight. But the true terror lay in the muzzle. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun fired a high-explosive HE round that could devastate infantry and fortifications, but its armor-piercing AP round was capable of punching through the frontal armor of the M1542 at standard combat ranges, a capability the Italian 47mm gun generally lacked against the Sherman. The disparity wasn't a matter of millimeters, it was a matter of terminal velocity and kinetic energy, of a difference in destructive purpose. Lieutenant Carlo Moretti, a young Italian tanker who survived the campaign, detailed the tactical horror. Our gunner, Rossi, would traverse the 47mm cannon and strike the Sherman's turret, sometimes 2 or 3 times. The shells would leave a scorch mark, perhaps a deep score, but that was all. No penetration, it was like shooting at a stone wall with a rifle. The initial laughter the Americans showed when they first encountered the smaller Italian tanks quickly evaporated, replaced by cold professionalism. But the terror was reserved for the Italians. The Italian strategy was forced into desperation. Direct confrontation was suicide. The only hope was to employ ambush tactics, to engage the Shermans on the flanks or the rear where the armor was thinner, or to lure them into carefully prepared anti-tank traps. This required flawless coordination, perfect timing, and nerves of steel. One such planned ambush occurred near a small hilltop town. 2 platoons of M1542s, 5 tanks in total, were hidden in the shadows of olive trees, waiting for an American column to pass. The tension inside the M1542s was a palpable metallic smell, sweat, oil, and fear. The crews listened, their ears pressed against the hull, waiting for the distinctive heavy roar of the Sherman's engine. When the American tanks appeared, they were not a column. They were an entire company. 10 Shermans moving with confidence. The Italian commander, following doctrine, waited until the lead Sherman was fully exposed. He gave the command, "Fuoco!" 4 M1542s fired simultaneously, aiming at the side of the lead Sherman. A flurry of 47mm shells struck the target. The effect was minimal. The Sherman shuddered, its tracks momentarily halted, but it did not cease to function. It swung its turret with brutal speed and precision, and the 75mm muzzle flashed. The sound of the return fire was not a crack, but a deafening, sickening metallic thwack that was felt more than heard. The Italian tank hit was immediately engulfed in a spectacular burning pyre of gasoline and exploding ammunition. Sergeant Rinaldi, watching from his position, described the scene as the moment of true, chilling realization. We did not see the shell, only the fire that followed it. It was not a fight, it was an execution. In minutes, 3 of the 5 Italian tanks were blazing hulks. The two survivors retreated frantically, their crews haunted by the sight of their comrades trapped inside the inferno of the riveted steel. The psychological damage was immense. The Italian tankers realized that the enemy tanks were not just technologically superior, they were functionally invulnerable to their main gun at any realistic combat range. The sheer scale of the American presence compounded the terror. For every Italian tank lost, the Americans could replace it threefold. Statistics tell the bleak story. The Italian war industry produced approximately 1,200 M-series tanks throughout the entire war. The US produced over 49,000 Shermans and variants. The industrial equation was as deadly as the firepower equation. The American tanker, too, had a perspective. An American gunner, Corporal James Mac McAllister, later said, "We felt bad for those guys. They'd pop up in their tiny tanks and take a shot, and it was like a pea shooter hitting a brick wall. We didn't even have to rush the shot. We just lined it up and ended the problem. It felt more like pest control than a tank battle." This dismissive attitude from the other side only highlighted the futility of the Italian position. They were not fighting equals. They were delaying an inevitable crushing force. The age of innocence for the Italian caristi was over, replaced by the grim knowledge that they were rolling across the battlefield in mobile, steel-plated coffins. October 1943, southern Italy. The battle lines solidify around tenacious German defenses, but the fight for the Italian tanks is one of rearguard actions and desperate sacrifices. Technological inferiority forces an immediate and brutal shift in strategy and psychology. The Italian tanker, once a symbol of the nation's might, was now reduced to a sacrificial pawn. The goal was no longer tactical victory over the enemy's armor, but the preservation of the infantry and the delay of the inevitable American advance. This act explores the profound transformation of the caristi from confident soldiers to determined martyrs. Their training regimen changed overnight. Forget frontal engagements. The focus became concealment, speed, and precision, all maximized for that single critical shot at the enemy's rear. The crews learned to identify the M4A3's weak spots with grim detail. The engine compartment grills at the rear, the thinner armor of the track return wheels, or in a miraculous stroke of luck, a shot to the turret ring. They were trained to hit and run, to fire and vanish, knowing that lingering for even 30 seconds could mean certain doom. The M1542 was fast, but its gasoline engine was a massive liability. After a single hit, the engine compartment, located at the rear, often exploded in a flash fire, a phenomenon the Americans brutally nicknamed Ronsoning the Sherman, after a famous cigarette lighter motto, "lights every time," but which applied even more frequently and tragically to the Italian tanks. The memory of the brew-up was a constant, suffocating fear inside the turret. A common internal monologue among the Italian crewmen, according to post-war accounts, revolved around the seconds after the first American shot. If the shot penetrates, we die in an instant. If it does not, we have 10 seconds to return fire and move before the next one hits and turns the tank into an oven. This shift in focus led to extraordinary, often suicidal acts of courage. There is the documented account of Lieutenant Edoardo Vianello, commanding an M1542 unit, trying to cover the withdrawal of German paratroopers. Surrounded by 3 Shermans, Vianello ordered his remaining 2 tanks to flee while he executed a diversion. He deliberately drove his tank directly into the path of the leading Sherman, exposing his thickest armor, drawing fire, and allowing his gunner a fleeting moment to get a side shot. His tank was immediately destroyed, but his gunner's desperate side shot immobilized the lead Sherman. This was not strategy. It was an oath to delay fate at the cost of one's own life. The psychological toll on the survivors was catastrophic. They were fighting not only a superior tank, but a war of attrition they could not win. The high-quality radio systems of the Shermans meant that American units were always coordinated, always aware of the Italian positions. The Italian tanks, often relying on flags and hand signals, moved in relative silence, a terrifying solitude that amplified the sound of the approaching enemy engines. Perspectives from the field. Italian gunner, Private Domenico Balbo. Every time we entered the tank, we said our goodbyes. We knew the odds. We were not afraid of dying. We were afraid of the fire. To burn to death, trapped inside the steel box. That was the fear that made your mouth dry. American Tank Commander, Staff Sergeant Greg Olson. We started noticing that the Italian crews weren't running right away. They'd take 2 or 3 hits and still try to aim. We gave them respect for that. They were in junk tanks, but they were still trying to fight. The relentless loss of life and equipment began to cripple the Italian industrial war machine itself. Shell consumption was massive, but the production rate for the 47mm anti-tank rounds was falling far behind the demand. Soon, crews were rationed to a limited number of high-explosive rounds and very few armor-piercing rounds. The situation became a cruel paradox. The tank was technologically obsolete, and the ammunition required to fight above its weight class was scarce. The Caristi were experiencing a deep sense of historical irony. They were the inheritors of a proud military tradition, placed inside beautiful machines designed by talented engineers. Yet they were being undone not by a lack of skill or bravery, but by an invisible enemy, the limitations of their nation's industrial capacity and the short-sighted strategic thinking of their high command. They were fighting the wrong war, with the wrong tools, and their ultimate sacrifice, the art of dying well, was their last and only effective contribution to the defense of their homeland. The clinking of the 47mm rounds in their storage racks sounded less like a tool of war and more like the tolling of a funeral bell. Winter, 1943. Central Italy. The muddy, blood-soaked hills south of Rome. The Allied advance has slowed, bogged down by the harsh terrain and stiff resistance. In the midst of the brutal technological crisis, a quiet revolution was already happening within the Italian Armour Corps. The realization of the M-series tanks' inadequacy was not lost on the Italian engineers and tactical commanders. They recognized that they could not match the Sherman in size, speed, or frontal protection. Irony strikes again. The very industrial constraints that made the M1542 obsolete forced the adoption of a truly innovative design. The answer was the Semovente, Italy's line of self-propelled assault guns. This was the armorer's last, most effective gambit. Built on the same chassis as the M-series tanks, the Semovente series adopted a casemate design, a low-profile box-like structure without a turret. By eliminating the turret, they could mount a significantly heavier gun while keeping the overall vehicle weight manageable for the struggling Italian engine design. The most potent of these was the Semovente da 7534, and later the truly dangerous Semovente da 7546 and 10525. The nomenclature tells the story. A 75mm gun with a longer barrel, L34 or L46, or a heavy 105mm howitzer, L25. These vehicles were an immediate, desperate attempt to level the playing field. The 7546 was a direct response to the German concept of the Stug 3 assault gun, prioritizing concealment and raw firepower over mobility and flexibility. 1. Firepower. The longer 75mm and 105mm guns could finally penetrate the Sherman's side and rear armor, and even challenge the frontal plate at close range. 2. Low profile. The turretless design meant the Semovente sat much lower to the ground than the M4, making it an excellent ambush weapon. Difficult to spot, easy to conceal, and capable of delivering a powerful punch before relocating. 3. Psychology. For the crews, stepping into a Semovente was a psychological relief. They were in a vehicle that had a fighting chance, a machine designed not to fight like a tank, but to hunt other tanks. This new technology created a surge of hope, a desperate counter-narrative to the despair of the M1542. Major Alessandro Conti, an engineer involved in the 7546 design, noted later, "We could not beat their industry, so we had to beat their design. We sacrificed the turret for the gun. It was a crude design, born of necessity, but it was honest. It could kill a Sherman." The Semovente units were immediately thrown into the most critical defensive battles. They excelled in the hilly, broken terrain of the Italian peninsula, acting as hidden anti-tank bunkers. The American tankers, who had grown complacent facing the easily defeated M1542, were now surprised by this low-slung, powerful new enemy. A single powerful moment highlights the shift. During a skirmish near a mountain pass, a crew in a Semovente 7546 allowed 2 Shermans to pass, knowing they could not fire on the thick frontal armor. The third Sherman, advancing cautiously, was struck by a single 75mm shell from the concealed semovente. The impact was catastrophic, igniting the American tank instantly. The semovente fired a second shell at the first Sherman's rear before withdrawing into a hidden bunker position. The Americans were momentarily stunned, their confidence shaken. The small Italian tank had finally found its teeth. However, the semovente was only a temporary tactical fix, not a strategic solution. Italy's defeat was already cemented. Production of the semovente models was severely limited. By the time the most potent variants were ready for deployment, Italy had surrendered to the Allies, September 1943, and the remaining Italian forces were fractured into those fighting alongside the Germans and those fighting with the Allies. The legacy of the semovente, therefore, is one of bitter historical irony. It was the moment Italy's armor doctrine successfully corrected itself, producing a vehicle technically capable of meeting the Allied threat. But the correction came too late. The men who fought in the M1542s died as martyrs to an obsolete machine. The men who fought in the semoventes fought bravely, but only as part of a collapsing, fractured front, their ultimate technological victory overshadowed by the strategic reality of the war's conclusion. The armorer's last gambit was successful in design but ultimately futile in destiny. Spring 1944. The final brutal grind in the Apennine Mountains. The M4 Sherman, now supplemented by the better-armed M4A3 Jumbo and M4A1 76W, is an unassailable tide. The war grinds to its conclusion, leaving behind a battlefield littered with the twisted, rusted husks of the defeated. The final act of this technological drama is the enduring legacy of the men who fought in the M-series tanks. Their story is not one of a decisive victory, but a timeless lesson in the brutal, unforgiving relationship between courage and technology. By 1944, the distinction between Italian and German armored units had blurred under the banner of the Axis defense. But the memory of the early clashes in Sicily and southern Italy defined the Italian tankers' contribution. They were the first to face the full unbridled force of American industrial mobilization in the European theater, and they paid the ultimate price for the pre-war technological complacency of their nation. The M4 Sherman itself was not a perfect tank. Its own design flaws, the high silhouette, the vulnerability of early ammunition storage, and the frequent brewing up would be harshly exposed later in the war by the superior German Panther and Tiger tanks. But the final historical irony is this: the Italian tankers were destroyed by a tank that, only months later, would itself be considered technologically inferior by the Germans. The M15A42 was not just behind the Sherman, it was 3 to 4 years behind the technological curve, a massive gulf that even the bravest crew could not cross. The human cost was devastating. While precise casualty figures are difficult to confirm due to the fracturing of the Italian military, the loss rate for the M-series tanks in the initial months of the Italian campaign was close to 80% in many frontline units. The average life expectancy of an Italian carista in a pitched battle against a full Sherman company was measured in minutes. The lasting impact, however, lies in the testimony of the survivors. Private Domenico Balbo, the gunner from Act 3, who survived the war by joining the anti-Axis partisans, summarized the experience. The M15 was our home. It was also our tomb. When they talk about courage, they talk about charging. But real courage, I believe, was knowing you had a 2-ton machine facing a 30-ton machine, and still closing the hatch. We faced the tank, but we faced the future of warfare, and we lost. The true legacy of the Italian tankers is their contribution to the Allied understanding of tank warfare. Their sacrifice informed the American strategy, confirming the overwhelming effectiveness of the M4 against light armor and encouraging the doctrine of industrial mass deployment. For the Germans, their failures against the Sherman were a clear warning sign of the power of the 75mm gun, accelerating their own shift toward heavier, longer-barreled guns. Thus, the Italian M1542, in its destruction, indirectly contributed to the escalation of the tank wars that followed. Their story is not one of glorious triumph, but of profound human drama. The pride of craftsmanship turned to ash, the certainty of doctrine betrayed by reality, and the willingness of men to fight on, even when they knew their only victory would be a few minutes' delay. They fought the wrong war in the wrong tanks at the wrong time, and in doing so, they provided one of the most poignant cautionary tales in military history, that the bravery of the soldier, no matter how immense, can never overcome the unforgiving logic of industrial-scale technological progress. The wreckage of the M1542 remains scattered across the fields of Sicily and southern Italy, silent, riveted monuments to the final, fatal days of an armored age that had already passed. If the stories of the men caught between strategy, courage, and technological progress grip you, then the journey through military history is just beginning. Subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to ensure you don't miss our deep dives into the forgotten theaters and pivotal technological battles that defined the Second World War.